We're here live at the UN Climate Change Conference, COP23, at the CGIAR exhibition booth. I'm currently here with Alain Vidal, Senior Advisor of External Engagements at the CGIAR Systems Office. Alain, could you kind of tell us why do you think it's important to include agriculture in the discussion relating to climate change?
Well, it's absolutely important and essential that agriculture be on the agenda for climate change because agriculture is the economic sector which is the most affected by climate change and will be even more in the future. And also one of the sectors that emits the most greenhouse gases. So it's a major dimension. It hasn't been so far clearly on the negotiations table because of tensions between developed countries and developing countries. Developing countries insisting on reducing emissions, mitigation, and developing countries insisting on adaptation. Both are important to us as a CGIAR, and both are important in agriculture. And we've developed a lot of solutions in CGIAR that combine both.
Okay, so could you give us maybe what is being done currently in the ag world to steer us toward a more sustainable climate future? You said, there's a lot being done in the CGIAR, but what exactly is being done?
Well, in front of us here we have 10 cards that summarize innovations, but I'd like just to give a couple of examples. I think there's one thing which is key and which is more and more discussed here. Is about crop insurance or livestock insurance. It's about insuring smallholders against climate extremes. It's an essential aspect of climate adaptation because it's the only way for farmers to sustain extreme events, several years of droughts, which they are not equipped to face. And this exists already in the developed world. It only emerged after World War II. It was for a long time financed by the states. It's now financed partly by farmers in most countries. And it is emerging in the developing world, and where it has emerged, in many places facilitated by CGIAR, be it on crops or in livestock for pastoralists like in Eastern Africa, it has proven extremely useful for farmers to adapt. I'd like to give an example on mitigation as well, how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including in the developing world. We know rice is a major greenhouse gas emitter because rice emissions are close to 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And there are practices which CGIAR has developed with its partners through IRI, the International Rice Research Institute, looking at practices that save water, that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's a typical practice that both reduces emissions, but by saving water also makes rice cropping more adapted to climate change, increased water scarcity, or increased climate variability. And so what we really try to do in CGIAR is developing techniques that will work for smallholders in the developing world, that combine adaptation and mitigation, and that increase food security for the rural poor.
Okay, thank you so much. So there's a lot of side events going on, a few that we're actually hosting through CGIAR. And you just facilitated a side event on gender-responsive adaptation in smallholder agriculture. What was something maybe you learned, or what are the take-home messages from that event?
Yeah, so I was this morning indeed facilitating an event on mainstreaming gender, on climate adaptation measures in agriculture. It's an essential dimension because women play a specific role, more and more because there are more and more farming women in the world, partly because a lot of men are migrating in the same country to get a job in the city and ensure a decent income for the family. So we have more and more farming women around the world, and often the techniques we're offering are techniques changes approaches we are offering as research agencies, as development agencies are transmitted to men. So important to have this access to information and understanding what their role can be in adaptation, in adapting food production to climate change. Two lessons from that one, I would say. One is that there's a need for a lot of things can be done at local scale, and people are quite open to given a bigger role for women at local scale. It's less obvious at political scale, at government scale, and so we really need to make sure that understanding more the role of women in climate adaptation in smallholder agriculture is also something that is not only a box which is ticked into a program or policy, but something that really happens and has impact. And I think the other thing where I left a little bit hungry at the end, was not having seen a clear financial benefit. And I think if we want to get more finance for climate adaptation, which especially the developing countries keep calling for here in this climate conference, we also need to show the benefits of climate adaptation, and so we also need to show the benefits of these gender mainstreaming approaches.
Right, and so, I mean, most of the discussions this week are really focused on the Paris Agreement work program and preparation for the facilitative dialogue. So you recently made a presentation on how to improve the agri-food companies' reporting on their efforts and commitments towards achieving the Paris Agreement's 2-degree target. So what are the challenges here, and how can CGIAR help?
Well, I think the challenges that the private sector companies are facing in the agribusiness sector and beyond, who I would just like to remind that they took similar engagement commitments as the one that were taken by the states who signed the Paris Agreement, is to follow the progress they're making and making sure they are they're in line with the targets they gave themselves in terms of greenhouse gases emissions reduction, climate adaptation. I think that they're facing two difficulties in which we're trying to help them, and we'll next year set up a training globally and then in regions to help those companies who are willing to make a progress on that. One is on climate adaptation. They made a commitment to improve adaptation of smallholders to climate change, and clearly this is something which they've never measured. They've never really measured how farmers improve their livelihoods, how steady this improvement is, how is it affected by climate change. So they clearly need to find ways to measure that. They may need to find and to support insurance systems to do that, because they want to secure the sourcing of their products, and so they can't afford a big drop in production. So they are directly interested by climate adaptation, but they don't necessarily how to measure it. The other dimension which is difficult for private companies to measure is in greenhouse gases emissions, what we call Scope 3. And Scope 3 are the emissions which are generated by the products that in a value chain you purchase yourself. So assume you are Kellogg's company and you are producing cereals for breakfast. You need to buy cereals from the markets. And so how do you measure the greenhouse gases emissions that resulted from the production of these cereals? And even if most of these companies have integrated measurement of emissions or climate impact of their own production, they need to go backwards in the value chain and have other measurements put in place. So the whole challenge here And of course, it's even more important for the large retailers because the products they are marketing, of course, come from different sources.
Okay. And so kind of a final question just to wrap it up. What do you expect kind of out of all of these discussions and all of the conversations, an outcome for agriculture by the end of COP?
Well, I would say my first expectation is that agriculture be more considered in the discussions. But I would say the challenge is to make sure we realize, and that's what the different events we are organizing here with CCAFs are aiming at, we realize that agriculture brings a significant contribution to fighting against climate change. And we should overcome the tensions that have been so far between the industrialized world, the emerging countries, the developing countries, on the one hand, the private sector and the civil society on the other hand, and find a common ground, because we'll need to eat tomorrow, and we'll need to make sure that we can live in a climate which is not harmful.
All right, thank you so much, Alain, and thank you everyone for watching, and make sure that you check out if you're here at the event, to check out some of our side events that we have going on. Come visit us at the booth or follow us on social media, and you can watch all of our events being live streamed. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Katie.